Now, if there's anything I regret about my relationship with my dad, which was very good, was never sitting him down with a tape recorder and saying, "Go on then, tell me what happened." I wish I'd sat down and found out more about his incredibly colourful life. Dad attended a Catholic boarding school in Visakhapatnam near Madras, and at 16 he joined his father in the railway. And then he told me there was this incident that happened. It was just a flash, a moment that changed his life. He went on a holiday to the big city, which was Calcutta, and while he was there, he saw a ceremony. The date was the 16th of February, 1922, the day Lord Lytton was installed as the Governor of Bengal, and the day that changed my dad's life. You can imagine what the pomp and circumstance of the British Raj in full plumage had on an 18-year-old from the stakes. He was mightily impressed, and without consulting his parents, he resigned from the railways and joined the Calcutta Police as a sergeant. It was a stimulating and dangerous time to be in India. There was an active independence movement, and the British authorities were balancing keeping law and order with the desire for self-rule. Today, the fashionable figures of the independence movement are held up as the non-violent Mahatma Gandhi and the British-educated Congress Party leader Jawaharlal Nehru. But it was another man, Subhash Chandra Bose, the leader of the Indian National Army, who was the biggest threat to the future of British India. And under the theory of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, he allied himself with the Nazis.
Unseren gemeinsamen Sieg. Lang leben die Dreifachmächte und ihre Verbündeten. Lang lebe das freie Indien.
There were also underlying tensions between Hindus and Muslims. If India was not to be ruled over by the British, who would rule over it? That discussion was frozen on the 3rd of September 1939.
As Mrs. Chamberlain and the Prime Minister drive to the Commons, the House assembles for a fateful last debate before Britain declares war not on the German people, but on the leaders of the Nazi regime.
In India, a secret deal had been hammered out. If Indian nationalists kept quiet and supported Britain during the Second World War, after the war, Indian independence would be on the table. Meanwhile, Dad's career in the Calcutta Police had flourished. He'd been promoted through the ranks: sergeant, inspector, chief inspector, and finally assistant commissioner. Here he is in a 1943 US government information film with two American Army logistics officers huddled over maps of the city. During World War II, Calcutta was an important strategic hub. Supply ships carried heavy equipment, tanks and trucks and ammunition up the River Hooghly to the docks. From there they were transported through the overcrowded city to the front line in Burma. It took a lot of organizing, and as assistant commissioner, Dad's responsibility was making sure the supply lines worked. Calcutta was bombed several times by the Japanese. Warehouses and railway lines were hit, civilians were killed. There was panic in the city and an exodus of frightened citizens. As Dad was in charge of fire watches and the emergency services, he was also responsible for a network of telephone operators, and one of those telephone operators was my mum.
General Jodl, the representative of the German High Commission, signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender.
For most people of the age, the Second World War was the most vulnerable physically they've ever felt, the time of most danger. But if you lived in India, the worst was yet to come. Mum and Dad were no doubt planning a quiet, happily married life in British India. In the back of their minds, they knew calls for Indian independence would be answered, but not now, not yet. However, events 5,000 miles away were about to put an end to all that. The election of 1945. With Churchill out of power, Clement Attlee's Labour Party now signalled that the independence of India would be fast-tracked.
The Labour Party's great victory shows that the country is ready for a new policy to face new world conditions.
But there was a problem. Hindus wanted a united India, Muslims wanted their own breakaway state of Pakistan. The two factions jostled for position before the imminent talks with Britain were about to begin. Then, disaster. The All India Muslim League brought a match to the tinderbox. They called for a day of action in Calcutta. They instructed their followers to gather in the centre of the city, which meant they had to travel along roads which were through Hindu areas. The violence began in the suburbs and spread to all parts of the city. Dad told me that all the graves that they had dug, expecting a Japanese invasion, all those graves were full of dead from the Great Killing of Calcutta, as it was known. The riot lasted for 4 days. No one knows exactly how many people died, between 5,000 and 10,000, with around 100,000 people injured. And remember, these deaths were all caused not by guns but by knives. People were stabbed. As my father said, you could hear the shrieks through the darkness of the city. Just a few years ago, at a reunion of cousins, my uncle Thomas Maguire told me something I never knew. He said, your dad was a bit of a hero during the Great Killing of Calcutta. What he used to do was to go to Muslim areas and take the Hindus out, and go to Hindu areas and take the Muslims out, and also look after the British and the Anglo-Indians. In fact, he was so well known, he was known as the Scarlet Pimpernel of Calcutta. The violence spread from Calcutta throughout India. The worst atrocities were in the Punjab. Fearing the splitting of the country along religious lines, Muslims fled east, away from Hindu areas. Hindus went west, using any method of transport they could. There was tremendous violence, carnage. The total number of deaths is estimated by historians as more than 1 million people. Meanwhile, the independence project continued. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the new Viceroy of India, appointed by Attlee, wanted the whole business behind him. He was impatient to get home. Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah expected the negotiations of a partition and the disputed territory of Kashmir to last for years. Instead, Mountbatten gave them just months. Partition was now inevitable.
During the past 200 years, the British gave India law and order. They built roads and railways. They irrigated the lands. But India's future welfare largely depends upon communal harmony. Through Karachi streets drives the Quaid-e-Azam, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Pakistan's first Governor-General. It's Karachi's first day of independence, and the crowds are out to greet him and Earl Mountbatten. On his last day as Viceroy, he is here to inaugurate the transfer of power.
India declared independence in August 1947.
Tumultuous crowds filled the streets, celebrating, singing and laughing. Police were called out many times to restore order, where everyone ran wild with joy.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge.
You may ask what became of Subhash Chandra Bose. A familiar story, I'm afraid. A mysterious plane crash. Problem solved. Of all the Indian leaders, Dad had the highest respect for Gandhi, whom he arrested in 1929.
The whole world was shocked by the news of Gandhi's assassination. Known as the father of India's independence, Gandhi, with perhaps the largest following any man ever had in his own lifetime, was one of the most vital figures of our age.
With the coming of Indian independence, the colonialists, the people who'd been there for 2 generations, if not more, they would call them expats now, had to make up their mind. Were they going to be loyal to the new Republic of India, or were they going to go back home if they knew where home was? Here are the 2 passports that my father and mother had at the time. They're British Empire passports, pretty rare objects. Let me show you. There's my mum. Funny old haircut. And this is a quite well-known picture. I have it up on my dining room wall of my father. But leaving India wasn't as easy as just saying, the empire's done, we're shutting the door and turning out the lights and going home. The going home part took about 15 years. Mum and Dad must have breathed a sigh of relief that the tumultuous decade was over. They married on the 5th of January 1947, and I arrived in October of that year. Dad got another promotion, this time to Deputy Commissioner, and with it came a wonderful surprise, a 9-month trip to England, an attachment to the Metropolitan Police in London, which meant Scotland Yard. But that is a story for another time.